Welcome to the Wolfpacker.com podcast, a little bit of a Zoom-style podcast. I'm your host, Matt Carter, joined by my co-worker, Justin H. Williams, not the hockey player for the Carolina Hurricanes, but esteemed colleague. And I'm now also joined by ESPN's David Hale, ACC insider, every fan's favorite from the ACC. David, thank you so much for joining us to talk a little bit about NC State football. Before you've done a bunch of analyzing of NC State and everybody in the ACC, but before we get there, my NC State message board would not let me off the hook if I don't ask you about QBU and why NC State was not called. I think you did a list, last year?
Yeah, well, we're coming out with a new one. It'll be out at some point in the next, month or so, probably. I told my editors I want to name our 2020 list the Position U Returns Revenge of NC State or something along those lines. Look, I mean, what I tried to explain to folks at NC State and others who were complaining, though NC State was certainly towards the top of the list of the most vocal of complainers. These things are more complicated to put together than you might think. And, look, we're trying to analyze literally tens of thousands of players on this list. And so what it came down to was making a uniform decision of how we are going to handle transfers. So when you start looking at the list of great NC State quarterbacks, you have one that transferred out in Russell Wilson. Right. You have several that transferred in, Jacoby Brissett and Ryan Finley. And the way that would be most advantageous to NC State is to say, well, where did they take the bulk of their snaps? Which would have been a good, probably, way to do it, but a much more complicated way for us to do that for a database of the size that we had to analyze. So we made the blanket decision that their last school, the school that they graduated from, would be the one that got credit for what their numbers were. So Russell Wilson was not considered part of NC State, and so therefore NC State did not end up as high on the rankings as you might have assumed. We are tweaking this a bit for 2020, where we are going to try to, I think we're probably not going to change necessarily that part in terms of like Wisconsin would get credit for Russell Wilson's draft stock because that's where he was drafted from. But Russell Wilson's productivity at North Carolina State would still stay with North Carolina State. And hopefully at the end of the day, we get a slightly better version of what we had. It's always a work in progress. We're all a work in progress, if nothing else. But anyway, I don't want to discriminate against NC State, which has a lovely lineage of quarterbacks, but it does make for a good running inside joke of anger between me and NC State.
David, you're digging your own grave the minute you say Russell Wilson becomes an NC State player.
You're right. I know. But listen, if we didn't have things to argue about, especially semantic things to argue about, what would we be doing on social media all this time?
And to be fair, Russell Wilson, one of the most unique transfer situations out there. I mean, it's kind of most guys transfer for playing time, obviously, and his was a very unique situation.
We'll run into that a little bit as we do this year too with Jalen Hurts, which is again not quite an apples to apples. Russell Wilson, but a guy who had huge numbers at Alabama, got benched, and then got drafted in the second round out of Oklahoma, where he also put up huge numbers. So how do you necessarily say where Jalen Hurts is supposed to fit? So these are all the things. I mean, again, it's hard when you're dealing with a database of that many players to kind of say this is a one-size-fits-all answer.
Yeah. Let's talk about before we kind of move forward and look at NC State this year. You did a lot of looking back at last year when you did the numbers crunching, and I encourage everybody to go to your Twitter feed, and if you can find your position-by-position analysis. In a broad sense, nutshell version, when you looked at NC State last year, what went right, as little did go right, and not talking about the injuries and everything else, but just from the play on the field. What went right, and then briefly what stood out about what went wrong, because a lot went wrong last year.
Yeah.
But what stood out the most about what went wrong?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a difficult situation to analyze because you go through 3 different quarterbacks. So, it's hard to say how that. I mean, one of the problems when you're looking at stats from a college football standpoint is always sample size. I mean, even in the best of scenarios, you've got guys, which is not necessarily a lot. Well, now we're looking at analyzing, a handful of games in which Devon Leary was actually on the field. So you're even smaller sample size. With all the injuries, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, it's like, how do you really analyze how the performance was there? The takeaways that I had, I thought that the running game actually was better than maybe most people thought last year. I mean, watching it, I could understand why you would say, all right, we weren't really that good. They weren't really great at anything, but I thought they outperformed on the ground what would have been a reasonable expectation given all of the other stuff going on. Things weren't a lot better with Leary for good reason, but they were a little bit better. So I think there's room for encouragement that with an off season, with some better health around them and more stability with Leary in there, that those splits get even more obvious as we move forward. And then, look, a lot of it to me, the back end of the defense was so banged up, it's almost impossible to gauge how good they could have been. I am generally a believer that through those growing pains comes better things ahead. So I think that could potentially be a benefit. But the biggest thing has to start up front, where you had a few games early on where those guys in the D-line were productive, but that production was not consistent throughout the year. I think NC State's defense really lived and died with how much pressure they could create up front, and the answer against most better competition was not a whole lot. So to me, if I'm looking at like red flag for 2020, things that need to improve that won't just be about luck or consistency in personnel, it's the D-line. They've got to really make some progress there.
Justin?
David, you mentioned Devon Leary from last season as a potential positive and negative. What are you able to take away from his 5 starts to end the year last year, and how much do you agree with Taj Boyd's assessment of him within the past month here?
I haven't even seen what Taj said about him, so I apologize on that. And I should listen to everything Taj says because he's smart. But anyway, what was Taj's comments on him?
Well, it went viral, and basically he did a little jab into the NC State fan base explaining how bad things went last year. But he was pretty complimentary of Leary and definitely made him seem to be the next guy in the QBU pipeline, if you will.
And I mean, I look, again, when you're talking about 5 or 6 games of real playing time, it's hard to extrapolate too much, especially when everything that was going on around him was not particularly great either. But I think a couple of things that are inherently true about this is that, one, the offense was more functional with him than it had been, which is progress. And then number 2, I think just the ability to have some stability, to know that this is our guy. And I thought, look, I mean, for all the ups and downs last year, and I mean, it would be very easy for a coaching staff to last year. That hasn't been the case. Dave Doran was 100% bought in on Devon Leary from throughout the end of last season and throughout the offseason. They weren't out there trying to find an obvious starter on the transfer market. So I think it goes to show you that behind the scenes there's a lot of confidence in him, which is good too. So to me, there's some there's a whole lot going on that needs to get fixed. But Leary is, to me, I think, more foundational than of where a lot of the stuff. I mean, the receiver play was not great last year. That they need to be better at that part. I will say one of his biggest weaknesses, but this is absolutely true of almost every young quarterback, is that he tended to be in the pocket too long and didn't necessarily get the ball out as fast as he should have. I thought, you did see the sack rate go up a little bit with him. those are things that just experience helps. And he got that experience now. So I think they're in a much better position with quarterback moving forward. And I'm not going to Taj Boyd stamp this and say he's the next addition to QBU. I don't know if he's got an NFL future. It's probably a little too early to say, but I think they're in much better hands going into 2020 than they were to start off 2019.
How much did you mentioned luck last year? NC State didn't have a lot of luck. People know about the injuries, but there are some other ways where they didn't have a lot of luck. Like I think they only got 1 or 2 fumbles that hit the ground. I mean, there was some ridiculous amount of not recovering the fumbles, not a lot of interceptions. Are there any kind of numbers that say when you have that little luck one year that law of average gives you better luck the next year, or is that just hoping against hope right there?
No, there's a lot of law of averages that should, or regression to the mean, as we call it in the stats-based world, that should be in NC State's favor this year. One of the things I always point to is year-over-year change in your points off turnover margin. So that sounds probably more complicated than what it really is. The fact of the matter is, how many points did NC State score off of opponent turnovers minus how many points opponents scored off of their turnovers, and take that margin and compare it to the previous year. What teams had the biggest positive and negative swings? In most cases, you will see a regression towards the mean the following year. So if year 1 was 2018, year 2 was 2019, year 3 should be somewhere in between those two if there's a wide spread. NC State had an incredibly wide spread. In fact, they had the second largest drop in points off turnover margin in all of FBS last year. So if you go back and look, those kind of numbers are really indicative of teams that make a big jump the next year just because they have better luck. You mentioned fumbles and interceptions. Their rate of pass breakups for interceptions was really bad too. A lot of whether you come down with an interception is about luck. Whether you're getting your hands on a football, if you're in the right place to make an interception, that's skill. I'm not saying they were great at getting the pass breakups, but a smaller percentage of PBUs ended up as interceptions for NC State than you would typically expect too. So all of those things kind of point to a fairly significant change. And if I'm remembering, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if I'm remembering, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 110-point swing in points off turnover margin. So if you figure they swing back to just somewhere in between and you get them down to maybe a -40 or something like that, which would still be bad, but markedly better than last year. Well, that's about a 70-point swing over the course of the season. That's huge. That's the difference between a couple of wins and a couple of losses.
Exactly. When you look at NC State this coming year, one of the things that I'm concerned about for NC State is I couldn't necessarily, outside of the 2 kickers, I got 2 great kickers. I don't know if I know a whole lot of all ACC guys on the roster, on the starting lineup. Is that something that you kind of look at too? Are there any guys you see at NC State as all ACC caliber guys, and would that be one of the concerns you have if you're kind of stacking them up against the rest of the leagues?
Yeah, one of the funny things is if you look to, like 2017, 2018, when it really sort of ascended, a lot of those guys that people were pointing to either, and it was only kind of after the fact that we realized, like, oh, Kelvin Harmon's really good. Oh, Bradley Chubb's really good. Like, I don't know that we, as the general smart people in the media, pegged those guys as burgeoning superstars off the top of my, way before it happened. So it wouldn't surprise me if a few things really changed this year where we were like, oh, we should have been paying more attention to this guy. Look, I don't know that they are the most talented team outside of Clemson in the Atlantic. I would say when you start looking at the rosters, Florida State's probably more talented, but they've got some huge question marks too. Zonovan Knight was really good down the stretch. There's some good running backs in the league right now, but it wouldn't shock me if he turned in 1,000+ yards this year and was in that all ACC conversation. The O-line was not great, but probably better than what a lot of people thought. I mean, they can pass block. There's no doubt about that. They just need somebody to pass, and they need somebody to catch the ball. The blocking was all right. So, look, I think there's some room for some guys to be in that conversation by the end of the year that are clearly not going to be in the conversation at the beginning of the year when they're coming off a season like they were.
Justin?
Sorry, I was a little shaky on my end. What do you make of the receiving core progression last season? Some of it may have been quarterback play, some of it may have been on the receivers, but I mean, what do you make of guys like Emeka Emezi or Thayer Thomas that were so successful with Orion Finley, but maybe took a little bit of a step back last year?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a good question. I'm looking here at my rankings, and I had NC State of the 14 ACC teams, I had their receiving core ranked 12th for 2020. It to me is a big question mark on the offensive side. In fact, to me, probably the biggest question mark on the offensive side. So just kind of looking through their numbers from last year, there was a lot of inconsistency. They weren't great on third down. They weren't great in the red zone. It was just, there was some legitimate concerns about, what are we going to get out of these guys? So, I mean, the obvious one, I'm looking at their numbers, the catches per catchable target, they were dead last in the ACC last year. And that's the quarterback putting it in the right place for them to catch it and them still not making a catch. Those are huge problems. So, Emezi, Thayer, those guys, have shown that they can do it. I'm sure the inconsistency at quarterback does not help. I mean, I don't know how much I think a great receiver is great no matter who's throwing them the football. But, I mean, look, Calvin Johnson didn't always put up great numbers at Georgia Tech when his quarterback play was not great. He's the best receiver I've seen play in the ACC. So, look, I think consistency is going to be the key across the board. And, frankly, they can't be much worse in health luck than they were last year. So that's a good sign. They know who their quarterback is to start the year. So that's a good sign. So I would expect the receiving play to be better because of that. But the fact of the matter is those guys just need to be better themselves.
So obviously having a returning starter that started the last 5 games, and going into this season that Leary is the guy, according to Doran. What do you make of this shortened offseason here this year, and how much do you think that's going to impact the play here in early September as to the chemistry on the field with some of these guys?
Yeah, I mean, they're probably in better position offensively because there is a lot of returning starters. That they did get some playing time last year. The biggest thing is what we see generally in spring is sort of a defining of depth charts and an installation of basic what we want to do. Well, on offense, I think we largely had that for NC State already. I mean, not that it was 100% done, but I think more done than not. The defense is where I'd have some real question marks because you're talking about new scheme, you're talking about new starters all over the place, new coaching staff that has not really built a rapport with those guys because they're not working with them hands-on, face-to-face, day in and day out. That's, to me, I talked to a few coaches who are at schools where, they just got there. It's a new coaching staff, and they're like, the fact of the matter is we're going to have to hope we can learn fundamentals, particularly early in the year, because the ability for us to install is limited. So we're now looking at doing install in the fall camp, which means we're going to have to cut on the back end some of the more advanced stuff that we would have hoped to have done. So, look, it's going to come down, I think, again, to a lot of good fundamentals. Who's good at the fundamentals and who's not screwing up. I think you'll probably see a little more vanilla scheme than you might have, or at least sticking, I don't know if vanilla is the right word, sticking to what your bread and butter is and not getting too fancy because that stuff, there just isn't time to work on it.
Matt, do you have any other NC State specific questions? Because I've got a league-based question, if not.
I got one question about that. You mentioned defense. My main concern for NC State is the defensive line, because as you noted, inconsistency getting pressure last year. And then you add to that, they lost their 2 best defensive linemen. Granted, James Smith-Williams didn't play as much as you probably wanted last year. but Lowell Murchison was a pretty good player last year. Would I be fair to say that defensive line might be one of their biggest, if not the biggest, question mark on the team?
And I think look, it would have been, even in a normal year, I think it probably would have been the biggest question mark for them.
Yeah.
We're not in a normal year either. So, you've got on the line of scrimmage is one of those places where I think your off-season training shows up the most. So your O lineman and your D lineman, that's about building chemistry as a group, and it's about getting stronger and more physical. Well, when you're potentially at home lifting jugs of water because you don't have the right equipment to work out on, and when you're meeting via Zoom instead of doing drills together out on a practice field for voluntary workouts, those things show up. And so the fact that this was already a red flag area for NC State, this sort of puts a little bit of a fine point on the end of that. So, yeah, I think the difference between NC State going bowling this year and maybe being in that 6, 7, 8 win range and where they were last year, a big chunk of that difference is going to come down to how the D-line plays.
Real quick, I know you kind of, when you analyzed it, you kind of said Georgia Tech and NC State, on paper at least, probably in that bottom tier right now in the ACC. But I think you also tweeted you wouldn't be surprised if at least one of them surprised and got to a bowl game. What's your kind of overall outlook for NC State right now?
Yeah, I mean, kind of going through the schedule and looking at who they play, I don't think that they're at this massive talent disadvantage. If they're healthy, I don't think that they're at a massive talent disadvantage compared to a sizable percentage of their schedule. I mean, look, they're gonna be at a sizable disadvantage when they play Clemson, but that's true of everybody. So, and again, pointing to luck, I mean, this is always the thing that I point to and say, like, if you're going to see a team either fail to deliver or really exceed expectations, turnover luck is usually at the heart of that question. That's very much going in NC State's favor. I think the fact that they can't possibly be more banged up than they were last year, and again, the fact that they've got some offensive consistency. I mean, I think a 6-6 season is probably a very reasonable starting point. If they develop, particularly on the defense, a little faster than we might have thought, then maybe we're talking about an 8-win season. If things lag a little bit behind, maybe we end up 5-7. But, I mean, I think a bowl game is certainly not out of reach. I think just a matter of, like, a return to a norm in terms of luck, and then the offense progressing the way that you would expect them to at this stage. Like 6-6 seems like a very reasonable starting point.
Justin?
David, last year, other than Clemson, it was really a down year for the league in general. What do you think is going to be the trajectory this year? Do you think beyond Clemson it's going to be a little bit more competitive or just more of the same?
Last year, I think the league was not good last year. I mean, that's the bottom line. I think a lot of that started with really, really bad offensive line play. Going through and doing these position by position rankings, I did the O-line, and I was like, all right, well, Clemson's got a good one, Boston College has got a good one, Virginia Tech's is pretty good. All right, who's number 4? I think I ended up with Syracuse at number 4, and they were terrible last year. So, a lot of it comes down to just, like, I think they've got better quarterbacks in the league this year. I think it's going to be a good quarterback year, but somebody's got to protect them. There's a depth of yardage. He's got to open up holes for them. Because on the other side, there's some really good pass rushers in this league too. And that's one of the things. You look nationally, I was looking at Mel Kiper's big board for 2021 draft, and it's like their first round has, I think, one defensive pass rusher, and that's Greg Rousseau over at Miami. It is, at least going into the year on paper, a really down year nationally for pass rushers. ACC's actually got some pretty good ones. Cody Basham at Wake Forest comes to mind. Obviously, if you put anybody in a Clemson jersey, somehow they know how to get to the quarterback. So I think O-line play is the key to whether or not we're talking about the ACC as really probably the 6th best conference in college football last year versus, being at that level where they can be competitive with in some of those like ACC, SEC matchups and stuff like that.
You mentioned that the ACC has some of the best pass rushers in the league. One guy that we haven't mentioned on NC State is a potential riser in the all-ACC conversation, Aleem Mcneal at nose tackle for NC State. What kind of season do you expect for him, and where do you compare him to the rest of the league?
Yeah, I mean, look, those interior D linemen, I think, are always sort of the key and often get overlooked in these preseason conversations. Like when I start looking at personnel and evaluating teams, I start with quarterback. Are you in a good position at quarterback? And I look at the O-line. Can you block? Can you help that quarterback? I look at the D-line, and I say, well, when we start talking about D-line, it's like, how many sacks do those guys get? No. You need those guys in the middle, plugging the running lanes and creating opportunities for the sacks to happen. Now, again, one of the things that I pointed out earlier was that NC State was not great cashing in on opportunities when they had them last year. So I think it's one of the hard things to do with college football, and particularly when you start talking about positions like nose tackle, is to really evaluate without just sitting down and looking at the film, evaluate production from those guys, because it's their production and is really about creating production for the guys around them. And so they're going to need some more edge presence than they have traditionally had, or at least had last year. But I think that, again, there's upside. I mean, this time of year, we're in June, everybody is optimistic about the stuff that's going to happen for them in 2020. But I really do look at NC State, and he's a perfect example of the guy who you say, well, what are reasons to be optimistic? That clearly you have one there.
I'll wrap it up, David, by asking you to go out on a limb and tell me who you think is going to win the ACC next year.
Well, you guys won't believe this, but I think Clemson has a shot to be okay this year. Yeah. I will say
you're not jumping on the wagon.
I would be silly not to pick Clemson. I will say I think the other team that has kept coming up as I've done my rankings and my research, that I keep saying they had bad luck. They didn't necessarily cash in on a lot of good opportunities. They're returning a lot of really good players. It is Pitt. I looked at Pitt's numbers last year and came away saying, like, that should have probably been a 10-win team last year. Again, like everyone, bad offensive line play, but I think they'll be better at that this year. Their defense is going to be as good as anybody in the country. So that's the team I think is interesting on the Coastal. But, I mean, look, North Carolina has a great quarterback in Sam Hale and can certainly be in that conversation. Miami has dipped its toe into the transfer market and brought in some talented players again. Maybe things get turned around there. And then, you look at, I think, aside from Clemson, the Atlantic is wide open. I mean, how good can Syracuse be? More 2018 or are they more 2019? I think what's Boston College look like in year one under a new coach? How does NC State build on the foundation that was laid through very hard times last year? Louisville made a huge jump last year, but is that sustainable? I mean, when we talk about good luck, they were sort of the other end of that. They made a huge jump in terms of points off turnover margin and stuff like that. So I think they actually probably have to play better to end up at the same point that they were at last year. So that's, if you're looking for good news for NC State, it's like I said, I don't think there's a whole lot in their own division aside from Clemson that they can't get on the field with and feel like, hey, we can win some of these matchups.
Justin, unless do you have any other questions, Justin?
I mean, no. One question of interest from a national perspective, because I know you do a little bit of that writing. What do you feel the schedule is going to look like towards the end of the season, going into the bowl season, with a potential second wave of coronavirus? I know nobody knows what's going to happen, but we've obviously seen a shift towards an on-time start to the season. But what's your thoughts on the conclusion of a year?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I think it's telling that we've seen a lot of schools reschedule their fall classes around the idea of trying to get out and be done by Thanksgiving. That doesn't necessarily have to drastically change college football's season, where they would be wrapping up around that time too, prior to bowls. But I mean, if our projections are off by a few weeks, that does change things a whole lot. And the other thing is, like, we kind of talk about college football in sort of this monolithic sense of, like, everybody's on the same plane here. But that's not true. I mean, it's entirely possible that we're talking about, North Carolina and NC State and Wake Forest and Duke being just fine all the way through the season, but Boston College and Pitt being in real trouble at some point because of this. Miami and Florida State. I mean, we just don't, where you're at in the country, things are different. Hotspots have kind of emerged and then disappeared. And, every campus has got a different number of students. I mean, Wake Forest only has to worry about 3,000 students that are on campus. If you're Florida State, that's a much different number. And, then you start talking about just the size of the city that you're in. Pittsburgh, Miami, Boston College. I mean, even NC State is a little bit like Raleigh's not a small town. And your interactions are well beyond what you might just see on a normal college town campus. And then even down to the idea of, like, how are schools handling testing and all of that. I mean, I've heard a lot of different plans in place. So I think the most likely outcome is that for some teams, everything goes just fine according to plan and no major headaches. And for some teams, we're probably going to miss a game, or certainly have some potential star players miss a game or two because they're in isolation and quarantine. So, to me, I think the onus is on these programs to try to protect their guys as much as they can. But there's a lot of pressure in terms of the money that's at stake to try to push the envelope as much as they can too. It's a really difficult balancing act, and that's why I think we're very unlikely to get to Thanksgiving and say, wow, this all went just fine.
Yeah, I think the million-dollar question that hasn't really been answered is what happens when multiple players test positive. It's going to happen. I mean, it's naive not to think that'll happen. But I don't know if we know the answer to the question of what happens if 2, 3, 4 guys on a team test positive during a week. What impact does that have on that game that Saturday? Is the whole team out of commission for a couple of weeks? And I don't know if we have an answer to that right now.
Yeah, I look at it's going to come. There's going to be a lot of debate this year because, I mean, what will it be like if NC State happens to play Clemson and Trevor Lawrence is in quarantine that week? I mean, it is going to be a very strange season, I think, and we'll, as you said, I'm not sure anybody has answers right now. I think everybody is crossing their fingers and hoping for the best.
I can tell you what would happen in that scenario as we end this podcast, speaking from somebody who has followed and covered NC State for 15, 16 years now. The backup quarterback for Clemson would throw for 500 yards, touchdowns, and everybody.
I was thinking when you said about the 2 good kickers, boy, where were they a couple of years ago? But that's how it goes in NC State, right?
Yeah.
Come on, David.
What's that?
I said, come on, man. That's
bad memories.
Well, David, I appreciate you so much for doing this for us. You're a great follower on the ACC. And are there any fan base that really loves you right now?
Well, I have been saying nice things about Pitt, so I think they're back on my side again for the foreseeable future. We'll see. I'm sure I will say something that annoys them at some point.
Well, good luck with all that. David, thank you so much. Justin, thank you for joining us. And this has been the Wolfpacker Podcast.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, guys.